Welcome back, everybody, to the round analysis today of Mission San Jose KW versus Ardrey Kell KW, with Ardrey Kell speaking first on the pro and remember Mission speaking second on the con. Now, just as a refresher, this topic is resolved. The benefits of the Internet of Things outweigh the harms of reduced privacy. So get your flows, pause the video if you need to do that, and let's start now.
Sam and I affirm our first point of contention is creating intelligent electricity. As the Electronic Privacy Information Center writes, one of the most prominent examples of the Internet of Things is the smart grid, which is used to better manage energy consumption by creating a line of communication between machines to increase efficiency. As the Department of Energy furthers, smart grids integrate a plethora of technology, including sensors and monitors, to ensure that everything from simple household items to large manufacturing plants are running as efficiently as possible. The usage of real-time data translates to better energy production. As Gil Reitenbach of the American Institute of Engineers writes that the General Electric Company has used the Internet of Things to increase electrical output by 20%. This has two impacts, and the first is charging up the developing world. While it is hard to imagine, the International Energy Agency writes that currently 17% of the global population lacks access to electricity, also known as energy poverty. According to Brian Walsh of Time, 95% of those lacking electricity are located in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. He furthers, due to its lack of global attention and effect on an individual's health and wealth, energy poverty is the worst form of poverty. Luckily, the solution is near. As a 2014 Atlantic article explains, nations in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia have the ability to leapfrog energy grids, outdated energy grids, and start from scratch at the cutting edge as they enter their era of development. In his analysis for the Global Energy Institute, Peter Meisten found that increasing access to electricity had a strong positive relationship with life expectancy and GDP per capita, while significantly decreasing mortality rates. For this reason, the McKinsey Global Institute finds that 40% of the IoT's value over the next decade lies in the developing world. Second is making energy clean. According to a report conducted by the ABB Group, smart grids have the capacity to not only make current energy more efficient, but also integrate low-carbon energy sources into pre-existing power grids, such as solar or wind power. As Rishi Bhatt of SAP states, the Internet of Things is a vital mechanism for the advancement of green energy. This is why Oscar Alvarez of the KTH Institute found in his empirical analysis of the developed and the developing world that the implementation of smart grids has historically gone hand in hand with the increased usage of renewable energy sources. The impact comes from Ashoka Kella of the National Institute of Technology, who found in his analysis of a dozen energy sources that on net, renewable energy had 1/10 of the carbon dioxide emissions that fossil fuels had. Holistically, Masood Amin of the University of Minnesota furthers that the adoption of the smart grid would cause energy efficiency to increase and emissions to decrease by 18%, which is why he finds there's a 6-to-1 ratio of benefits to costs when it comes to adopting the smart grid. Overall, the implementation of smart grids can be seen throughout the world, not just in the United States. For instance, CNN reports that India plans to upgrade 100 cities with smart grids in the coming decade, and the China-Britain Council reports that China has already implemented almost 300 smart grids throughout various cities. Our second point of contention is creating intelligent agriculture. A Beecham research report finds that precision agriculture makes use of a range of technologies that include GPS services, sensors, and big data to optimize crop yields. Support systems, backed by real-time data, can provide information concerning all aspects of farming at a level of precision not previously possible. This enables better decisions to be made, resulting in less waste and maximum efficiency in operations. Jeff Hahn of RCR Wireless News finds that estimates show that farmers using agricultural IoT systems can see yields increase by up to 15%, which translates up to $100 more per acre. The impact comes from the World Bank, who finds that a 1% increase in crop yields creates a 0.6% reduction in the number of people living in poverty. Therese Corey of Beecham Research warns that if the farming industry does not embrace the use of precision agriculture and harness the emerging Internet of Things, it will be literally impossible to feed the world population by 2050. Feed the world and affirm.
Okay, so that is the AF case. Now, there's a couple things to break down. Let's start on the contention one. Now, this is obviously where an overwhelming majority of the case offense is garnered off of, and it's relatively stock. So essentially what they're arguing here is that smart grids basically are more efficient users of energy that use the IoT to expand electricity. And now they're going to be generating a majority of their offense off of the idea that it helps developing countries. So there's two impacts. Essentially, they first explain that electricity from smart grids helps save, global energy poverty. Now there's a unique problem with this, right? We have to be careful with arguments like this. They do give warranting in their case, explaining as to why smart grids are better, but there's no real explanation as to why just implementing normal power grids can do this, right? So that's going to be a big thing that you'll see the neg will kind of press on in their rebuttal. So keep in mind for that. But overall, it's a pretty good impact. The second one is probably the one that they're hoping to collapse on more because they read a lot more there. It's largely developed in terms of evidence and warrants. And it's the idea that smart grids help renewable energy sources, right? Two big things here. One, it's a criticism first. Be careful like this when you give your internal link scenarios, right? They just kind of assert as to why smart grids increase renewable energy. There's no warranting as to why it uses renewables. Why can't they be using fossil fuels as well? So that's kind of a gap in warranting, even though they have evidence to back the argument up, that might be exploited by the negative team in rebuttal. And the second thing is keep in mind, and we noticed that they didn't use terminalized impact, right? In this scenario, they didn't use how many people are saved, annually, or how many people die due to emissions, right? Rather, they use the evidence and use a 6-to-1 ratio of benefits. Now, for this specific topic, this is most likely going to be their weighing strategy, right? Let's look back to the topic. It's a benefit and costs topic. So they're using evidence explaining that the benefits are 6 times the costs. So probably their strategy in the back half is to go for this contention, right? And then go for the renewable impact with the weighing added on about the 6-to-1 cost benefit ratio from benefits to costs. And also, not only are they going to use this for weighing, but they're probably going to be using this evidence as a way to group a lot of the next pieces of defense and offense. So it's a pretty important piece of evidence that they're going to be using in a strategy in the back half of the round. And then lastly, right, what's really crucial is this argument is completely based upon the idea of the smart grid going to developing countries and increasing globally, which is why probably one of the most important cards in the actual case is the CNN evidence they read that says India and China are expanding, smart grids right now. So that's another thing you should be looking for in cases like these, right? They pieces of empirics that are used to basically explain a link. So that's their contention one. Their C2 is a lot shorter and is a lot simpler, right? It's a simple idea that smart energy, smart power, different types of the Internet of Things is basically used to increase the efficiency of agricultural output. Now, this is probably going to have a little bit of a higher impact simply because, as they say, it impacts the farmers around the world, right? So there's not really a quantified impact here, which is one of the weakest parts of their case. It's very scalar, very uncontextualized. However, right, it is a pretty solid argument at the link level. So probably when you're approaching this case, you'll realize that it's better to spend more of your time, and the neg will be doing this a lot too, on the emissions argument rather than their contention two, largely just because they invest more time, more evidence of their case, developing the warrant, link, and impact scenarios in the C1. So the C2 is okay, it's just not the best. Going to the second constructive, this is the neg, and let's start.
We negate. Our first and only contention is that the Internet of Things will supercharge the surveillance state. The IoT entails a rapid expansion of sensor networks embedded in everyday objects, including things like location trackers and cameras and microphones that never turn off. Harold Bauer of the McKinsey Institute projects that up to 50 billion IoT sensors will be active in 2020, leading Victor Meyer of Foreign Affairs to predict that the amount of digitalized personal data will double every 3 years, while the International Data Group writes that, quote, there will be a 13% increase in unique new data by 2020 collected by new technologies. Unfortunately, as Matthew Olson of Harvard explains, these sensors are the prime mechanisms for mass surveillance, as they allow governments to conjoin more data from various sources to create a singularity of information that is more personal and more dangerous than the sum of its parts. The way governments access our data is by exploiting vulnerabilities. As Peter Denning of the Naval Postgraduate School explains, IoT companies rush their products to the market because if they spend too much time developing, competitors beat them to the punch and they lose market share. Corporations therefore minimize time spent fixing defects and securitizing, which is why Denning finds that companies release tech despite being aware of critical vulnerabilities 80% of the time. Olson furthers that over the last few years, the increased availability of encryption has slowed surveillance efforts to a halt. However, this effect is quickly being reversed by the Internet of Things. As Luigi Azzori of the University of Cagliari explains, IoT components are fundamentally characterized by low capabilities in energy and computing resources, and therefore cannot implement security schematics. Even if IoT devices were protected, governments would simply force companies to build backdoors into products either through monetary incentive or compulsory legislation, while Tim Sparapani of Forbes writes that as countries like the United States, China, and Russia pursue these backdoors, surveillance capabilities will increase at an alarming rate. The intent is clear. Ex-CIA Director David Petraeus says, quote, "The emergence of an Internet of Things will be a treasure trove of data for identifying persons of interest." IoT-based surveillance is more intrusive for two reasons. First, by compromising other devices. Unlike conventional technology, the IoT operates on machine-to-machine communication, where each sensor on a network transmits data to every other unit. This allows officials to infiltrate one device and gather data from others. Indeed, a 2015 HP Enterprise report finds that as IoT adoption expands, security concerns exponentially multiply as intrusions can lead to a single gateway that accesses 60 others. Second, by raising the threshold for what can be watched. Conventional surveillance is limited to the digital world, specifically information that people decide to close online with consent. In contrast, the IoT bridges the technology into the real physical world. As Neil Richards of the Harvard Law Review writes, over the next 15 years, the Internet of Things will increasingly be built into our appliances, homes, and infrastructure, subjecting previously unobservable activity to close scrutiny. Bruce Schneier of The Guardian concludes, the Internet of Things will give governments and corporations that follow our every move something that they don't yet have. Eyes and ears. The impact is discrimination. For example, Deepa Kumar of Rutgers University writes that any expansion of the surveillance state strengthens institutions of racism as governments tend to focus on minorities due to aggregates of poverty and crime. And for example, the ACLU quantifies black citizens are 2.5 times more likely to be watched than their non-black counterparts. Valkia Sarwal of the Progressive Institute continues that because the widest net is cast over the black population, African Americans are exponentially more likely to end up in prison and have fundamentally become intertwined with perceptions of criminality. This effect certainly isn't limited to the United States. As Gordon Goldstein of the Wall Street Journal writes, overtly racist governments like Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, and Russia have all designed tactics to manipulate the Internet of Things and have shown their intent at the International Telecommunications Union Network conference. Michael Mickenberg of the Georgetown University furthers, autocratic regimes in Eastern Europe and Central Asia have historically used surveillance as a tool to control and oppress ethnic minorities. Until this trend is overturned, MIT's Noam Chomsky writes, governments will, quote, use whatever technology is available to combat their primary enemy, their own population. Far from representative, nations only serve segments of the population that are dominant, affluent, and of the same color. As a result, Catherine Beckett of the University of Washington argues, the most unsurprising consequence of an intensifying surveillance state is the burgeoning number of minorities that are suppressed, incarcerated, and marginalized by their government. In order to prevent this structural oppression, we urge you to negate.
Okay, so that is the negative case. Now, a couple things we need to do and just think about overall about the structure before we get into the specific argumentation. So one, this is a comparatively more fast case compared to the AF, right? This is probably obviously going to be a tech round they're debating in. So given that this round was 5 years ago, even though it's tech, it's a little slower than tech rounds now, but it's still fast. Secondly, it's sole contention. It's a narrative-based case, right? This means they're going to be hiding a lot of spikes, pieces of embedded defense in their case. And on the other hand, this is also largely a product of the topic, right? Because the neg is only constrained to the on this topic to talking about arguments about privacy. So this team's idea, right, Mission's idea in this scenario was to just go all in and focus solely on one impact of privacy, probably the worst one that can be found in terms of high severity. It's a really bad impact in terms of how bad it can hurt people, and they'll be using that in the back half of the round. Okay, so with that said, let's break down the case, right? So first at the uniqueness layer, they're essentially arguing the idea that data use is going to be increasing, and companies, governments, et cetera, are going to be utilizing more of our data. So there is a couple things from this, right? One, they're looking to use this uniqueness as a front line to common responses being like, hey, they're not using a lot of surveillance now, right? If the AF team says that, most likely Mission, the neg, will be utilizing uniqueness saying that data collection is going to get worse in the future, meaning surveillance is only going to get worse after that. right? So that's the point of their uniqueness. Then, before they get into the specific links, it's very clear here to pay attention, because they have essentially 3 hidden spikes in their case as to why the IoT uniquely has holes in it in terms of lack of encryption, right? The first one is they tell you from the Jennings evidence that the IoT companies rush to market, right? 80% of products still have these security holes, even though companies know about them. That's the first way they'll be finding arguments saying IoT are secure. Secondly, right after that, they explain that IoT devices like phones have low capabilities in energy consumption, meaning the propensity for having high amounts of encryption and security is really low. So just the way they're designed makes it way easier to get access to. And the third and final one, which is probably kind of their last ditch effort, is if teams successfully win the idea that companies have strong encryption standards, for example, they tell you that government backdoors will mean that even if companies want to do strong encryption standards, governments will force them in one way or another, whether it be like they said, monetary incentives or government legislation. Okay, so this is going to be their main strategy to go for in the back half in terms of winning their links, right? They need to win. Not only is that IoT devices are worse for surveillance, but they also need to win that IoT devices are easier to get into. They have to win both of those parts to gain actual comparative offense, right? Because if the AF team proves that IoT surveillance is just like any other surveillance, it's not as bad, then their link is heavily non-unique, probably can't go for that well. So with the kind of spikes out of the way, their 2 links are very simple, right? It's 2 warrants as to why IoT surveillance is uniquely worse than surveillance normally. The first one is that simply since IoT devices are kind of connected in a web, if they get access to one IoT device, the government or whoever is trying to do the spying can get access to the other ones. On top of this, right, their second link is talking about the idea that specifically IoT devices, right, instead of just normal like internet surveillance, knowing what we want to put on the internet, IoT surveillance observes people in their everyday lives, like think of like your Google Nest cameras or Amazon Alexa or Google Home, stuff along those lines. And their argument is that fundamentally, since they observe you in your personal life, it's way easier to get really personal information on you. So those are the 2 warrants as to why IoT surveillance is uniquely worse. Now, the impact is probably going to be the most important strategy in terms of perfecting and going for their argument in the back half, right? So it's discrimination. They are arguing, again, that surveillance allows governments to propagate racism, target minorities, etc. Now, their strategy most likely is going to be in rebuttal. They're going to be reading weighing overviews and framing about how we should reject racism or preserve structural go against and prevent structural violence or structural oppression. So that's largely going to be their strategy in the back half of the round rebuttal, winning the framing and then winning their case, right? Because their offense is entirely linking into one impact about discrimination, meaning that in the back half of the round, the AF team should probably already be thinking here how they're going to be dealing with the framing in the back half. And this is, quarters at Glenbrooks. I'm sure they've hit arguments like this before. So the weighing debate is going to get pretty good, pretty fast, and, pretty deep. So that is the negative case. To put it simply, it's a narrative case heavily dependent on uniqueness and spikes, and is linking into discrimination impact that it's going to be blown up in the rebuttal summary and final focus speeches all around framing, linking in, and structural violence as a way for them to kind of try to frame out their opponent's arguments. They're going to be reading warrants as to why racism should be rejected outright, as to why structural oppression comes first, all of really the common tenets of structural violence framing. All right, so this is going to be first crossfire, so just listen in for any stylistic comments or anything that they mentioned in their in cross. So let's start now.
Compared to the surveillance that's going on right now, how is the impact on minorities and people of color any different in the world?
What do you mean?
Aren't people already jailed and discriminated against to such a high level today?
Yeah,
Okay, so how does that get so much worse in your world?
We're not saying it gets so much worse. We're saying it gets worse.
All right. Moreover, why do you
Actually, do you mind if I get a question?
No, go.
Okay, sure. So let's talk about electricity. First, you say that we're going to expand electricity to Africa. Second, you say that we're going to make clean energy. Aren't we trying to do that without the Internet of Things anyways?
I mean, the Internet of Things accelerates that process.
How much?
How much?
Yeah.
Like 6 accelerations. Like, what do you want me to say? Like,
I don't know. Maybe a time frame.
All right. Alvarez says that historically, anytime we've developed smart grids, empirically, what has happened is more development of renewable energy sources in tandem. Does that?
But how much more?
How much more?
Yeah.
Like I say, like a 1-to-1. I don't know. But like, more importantly, let's talk about why do you, like, let's talk about your case. Why do you assume that there won't be like encryptions or protections on like important IoT data?
That's not my assumption. So Ardrey writes that these devices are primarily based on low computing power and like
Just
low
because
energy
they have
capacity.
low computing power, why does that mean that servers
It means
can't be
that
protected? Servers that
The
hold the data
servers,
can't be encrypted.
the servers don't really have anything to do with the Internet of Things. Once you get into
Yes,
applying,
they do. Hold on. When you
Okay,
when you put
If I
information
can
into a
finish,
device, it's literally connected to another device. That's machine to machine, meaning it goes to something like a server, which gives that data out to
Sure.
other things. So why?
Sure.
My question is, why isn't there a level of encryption
because
on that
the
server?
server can be encrypted, but once you get into an IoT device, you get access to everything on the server.
That's
But
not
even
true.
if you,
That's how encryptions work. Just because you get
right,
access
and
to
our
one
argument
thing,
is
doesn't
that
mean you get access
encryption
to
is much
everything.
weaker on the Internet of Things because you need uninhibited
Okay.
network
We would
pathways
contend
for
that
a
just like
rapid transfer of
computers,
data.
we would contend that just like the invention of computers, that encryption would increase over time.
And our argument is that fundamentally and definitionally that's not possible because the Internet of Things requires rapid transfers of data on uninhibited network pathways. At best, you maybe get 64-bit.
No,
like so,
this
this is the
just your
Olsen evidence.
conjecture.
No. This is the Olsen evidence.
Which
It's very
was
clear in saying that. Right? Like for example, metadata also is really hard to be encrypted. That's
Olsen,
because it
what I
needs to
have
be
Olsen
transferred
saying is
rapidly.
that like data's
Okay,
data's
well,
important for
whatever you have him saying right now, just add that onto it, right? That's our argument, and we're going to maintain it for the rest of the time.
I would contend that even if there are high and like free amounts of data flows, then that still can be encrypted. And I would say it's encrypted at different levels too.
I agree,
For instance,
I agree.
things like medical records and like
No. Now I disagree. So we're just saying
hold
that.
on. I haven't even said anything. So things like
I
medical
know what you're
records
gonna say. I know
and
what
credit
you're
cards
gonna
information, those are going to have higher amounts of encryption than things like what your toaster does in the morning. Like,
Right, I agree with the fundamental idea that information should probably be prioritized, but my fundamental disagreement is that the encryption levels aren't differing by the importance of the data. It's just that all IoT data probably has a maximum of like a 64-bit or a 128-bit encryption, whereas computer pathways have a 1028-bit encryption that the government has not hacked into yet.
Can you
Has
simplify
not
that
created.
for me?
I mean, it's
Like, I
just
don't
like
know
it's
what
way
that
harder for us to encrypt like pathways that the Internet of Things transfers data on.
How
That's
can I
like
take
been
your
our
word
argument.
for it? Can you like give me a source that says that?
That's Olsen, yeah.
Olsen? All right.
Because you didn't write it down yet. You have to do that.
The argument is that. Can I-
All right, so that was the end of second cross. Now, it was a pretty funny cross, right? Probably one of the more funny crosses that are on YouTube. But there's one specific thing I would just like to point out is that Max, that's the first speaker on Mission San Jose for the NEG, specifically was towing the line a little bit, right? It's always good to be in rounds, funny and charismatic, have a smile on your face, right? That's always a good way to, pick up Judge brownie points or have them, start to warm up to you more and like your speaking style and, be comfortable voting for you in the round. However, there were kind of times in the cross where he came a little bit aggressive, right? Kind of putting his finger and on his opponent's flow. So just as an overall reminder, just be careful when you do things like that. Like obviously in this round, right, you could hear the judge laughing. So it probably didn't mean as much to them as it could have been to another judge, but it's always good to just be careful about that. So the next speech we're going to be going to now is first rebuttal, and it's just going to be starting with an overview that he's going to read. Just at the top of their case on the flow, you can write that there. Let's go.
So really quickly on an overview, recognize that with the spread of the Internet of Things, you need a preceding spread of the Internet, and that comes from the GWSA, who finds that the IoT will directly facilitate the broadband expansion of networks. They find that by 2020, the number of Internet-connected devices in the world will almost triple to 25 billion. The spread of the Internet is important for 3 reasons. The first is that it spreads democracy. According to Keegan Wade of Georgia Tech, allowing half of a population to connect to the Internet sparks political discourse, which shapes the beginning of a democracy, which is why she finds that allowing Internet access increases democracy political rights and civil liberties by 15%. Second, it benefits the economy. As Shane Chu of Chuangyang University finds, a 10 percentage point increase in internet penetration rates increases real GDP per capita by 0.6 percentage points. Third, it saves lives. According to Deloitte, providing broadband access to 75% of the population has the ability to increase health literacy and as a result save nearly 2.5 million lives in the developing world. With that in mind, that's a unique benefit off of our case. Now let's talk about theirs. Their whole thesis here is this idea of surveillance. Recognize a couple of things on face. The first comes from Alina Saluk of NPR, who finds that governments across the world have reduced their push for a legislation allowing IoT to be used as justification for surveillance. This is a problem that's not even becoming a problem as they speculate it will be. Even more so recognized from the Freedom House report, autocratic governments, the ones that they talk so heavily about on surveilling their people, actually increase surveillance in the face of economic losses. So, cross-apply the observation I just gave you, which says that the internet actually provides economic benefits, you will see a decrease in the need for surveillance. Even more so, let's move to their own evidence, the Olson analysis, which they said that the government will use this data to surveil. Instead, the Olson analysis says that the data will be able to be used. It has the ability to be used to surveil. They never give you a probability that governments will 100% use this data to surveil on their citizens. Even more so, they then talk about this Denning, which says that 80% of IoT tech is vulnerable. The problem is, this is talking about smartphone apps, not the Internet of Things. Make them show you the vulnerability of the Internet of Things. Next, let's move on to this idea about backdoors, which they talk so heavily about. The problem is, backdoors have to be open. What David Auerbach of Slate finds is that the majority of private companies will not allow the government to have access to their data. So at that point, the government literally has no data pool with which they can discriminate from. But let's talk about discrimination. The first type they read you is police discrimination. What Colin DeLito of Nashville finds is the most egregious violations of racial targeting are fueled by cell site simulators, or stingrays, which is data pulled from cell phones. What we're talking about is massive police surveillance using cell phones, which are not a part of the Internet of Things. This is a problem that exists and is already a tremendously bad in the status quo without the Internet of Things. They never show you why the Internet of Things uniquely increases racial discrimination and police targeting. Make them do that for you. Even more so recognize that it's not as bad as they make it out to be. In fact, David Slancy of Stanford finds that the data, that big data produced by the Internet of Things increases police accountability, and it was the only reason why stop and frisk was deemed unconstitutional was because of big data created by the Internet of Things. Big data actually increases police accountability and subsequently decreases racial profiling. Next, let's move on to their only impact, which is discrimination on a general level. Recognize we're going to turn this on face from Alison Bruzak of PBS, who finds that the Internet of Things increases efficiency, which decreases inequality for two reasons. The first, it reduces the cost of living, which is inherently retrogressive, and the second, it allows people more time to find employment. Even more so, this is a problem that's going away in the status quo. What Scott Peppett at the University of Colorado finds is that the legal loopholes that allow for discrimination to exist today as a result of the Internet of Things are currently being closed. Even more so, look at the time frame analysis. As Brian Kruger of Rhode Island University finds that the effects of discrimination actually increase voter participation rates. What he finds is that people who are discriminated against by the government exponentially increase their voter participation rates and are more likely to affect democracy and change the government that they so badly feel about. At the end of the round, you might think, while this might be a problem now, except it self-corrects itself. Even more so recognize that every single piece of statistic that they read you in their case talks about regular surveillance. The 2.5 times African Americans, that's regular surveillance. It is their burden to show you that number increases with the IoT, insofar as they never show you uniquely why the Internet of Things worsens the racial discrimination that has already so heavily entrenched itself into the American political society today. They have no unique harms. The uniqueness is the only way you can negate in today's round, and the point where they have that, do not have that uniqueness, I urge you to affirm.
Can we see the
Okay, so that was the affirmative rebuttal. Now, before we get into kind of the overall content of it, I just want you to pay attention to the structure, right? So this is more of a line by line rebuttal where a large portion of the responses he gave, at least on a link level, were kind of responding to every single individual point and warrant, spike, and even specifically piece of evidence they made. And this type of rebuttal is extremely effective for these types of cases, because these types of cases need to be line by line, because there's so many hidden things in between them. Like we said, there's those 3 spikes. So he responded to those at a warrant level to an extent, but also responded to the evidence, right? So that's his strategy going into rebuttal. Now, let's start with the first thing that is probably the biggest ballot threat to the neg team going in a second rebuttal is the overview, right? It's just essentially like a chicken versus the egg argument about how the Internet of Things leads to the expansion of the Internet, right? With 3 impacts from it. Now, this is good. However, what is largely missing from this overview is implications, right? They need to be making analysis as to why all three of these impacts linked into the opponent's argument, turn the argument, or outweigh the argument, right? Because at this point, it's just very floated, uncontextualized offense. There's like a 0.6% increase in the economy. The only implication they really make is the Freedom House evidence later in rebuttal indicating that governments increase surveillance in times of economic despair. So that's some piece of weighing coming off the overview. However, all of that should be centralized and implicated, so it's a lot easier to collapse on, easier for judges to digest. So that's a big problem with the overview. Now, in terms of responding to the opponent's case proper, he's overall pretty good. Lots of coverage there, except instead of responding to the individual warrants as to why IoT is worse for surveillance, what he does instead is kind of respond to the impact level a lot more. Now, there are drawbacks and advantages of doing this, right? On one hand, it gives the AF team, or gives the neg team rather, more of like an argumentative leverage to go for it in the back half or when frontlining, because now they have pretty clean warrants to do link comparison with defense returns. But on the other hand, since they only have one impact, he read essentially what is 5 responses to the impact and invested that time that he reallocated from responding to the links to responding to the impact, right? Since they'll be garnering almost all of their highest labor of offense, aka the framing from the impact, he decided to focus on that more. So the strategy he employed in the back half of the rebuttal, does have its drawbacks and also has its benefits. So yeah, just something to keep your eye on. In terms of the responses to the impact, it's overall very good, very thorough. The only thing I would like to bring to y'all's mind is the turn where he talks about an increase in efficiency and inequality, right? There's 2 warrants given as to why it reduces the cost of living or the cost of employment. However, this kind of falls victim to the same problems with the overview. There's not really a lot of warranting as to why those arguments or links are necessarily true, unique to the IoT, and moreover, there's no link or piece of comparison as to why that links into discrimination. So it is a very good rebuttal overall, but looking from a strategic perspective, what the AF will have to do heavily in summary is implicate these offensive, responses as best as possible to link into the neg's framing and weighing they do, presumably coming in second rebuttal. So from a strategic perspective, that's kind of the one big, important thing on top of extending responses that the AF summary has to do when it comes for them to give their speech. That's it for the first rebuttal. Now, before I start the second rebuttal, just a couple things to note. Now, this round was about 5 years ago where summary speeches were still 2 minutes. So back then, there was a huge norm of where teams only needed to frontline offense in second rebuttal. So you'll see that in this rebuttal, the second speaker for Mission will be frontlining only the overview and then going to the opponent's case and weighing. Right? So it's slightly different from what is now the current norm in tech debate and PF, but it's similar in some things. So just be ready for that, how that makes the round play out, because with 2-minute summaries of this part, it's, makes the round collapse a lot harder in the back half compared to 3-minute summaries now. So the strategies that were employed and accepted by judges on the circuit were different from what it is now. But with that out of the way, this is the second rebuttal from the negative.
The judge is ready. So it's going to be an overview, and then I'm going to respond to his overview and then go down their case.
Is the overview on working?
I'd say float at the bottom part case. Wait, both at the bottom. Okay.
Of your case?
Yeah. Are you ready? I can ask.
Wait, no, now you gotta share them with me. First one of the day.
No, thanks.
Alright, we can
Okay. As an overview, weight racism first because Albert Memmi writes we must reject every instance of racism. No life is worth living if some lives are valued over others. Institutional racism is a systemic impact. It happens every second of every day. Lives are by definition temporary. Exacerbating racism is a generational impact. Our brothers in the Civil War knew this and sacrificed their lives to fight for the Union Army. Second, Scott Pepper of the University of Colorado writes in 2015 that the kind of discrimination the IoT brings cannot be controlled by anti-discrimination laws. This is going to be important later on, but now we go to his overview, basically like a third contention for them. But first, the argument is non-unique. It is profitable for companies. Ben Topper of The Verge writes in 2013 that Facebook proposed philanthropic endeavor to bring internet to the third world would bring itself enormous revenue as well. Corporations don't need internet of things to be the impetus to give countries the gift of the World Wide Web. But B, the argument is non-unique because Joe Gross of CNN writes in 2013 that the Google CEO has promised that everyone in the world will be on the internet by 2020. With or without the IoT, internet will reach every corner of the globe. Now, go to the contention one about intelligent electricity. Starting with the first up point about the developing world. First of all, I called for the Atlantic evidence. It does not address the price, the problems with like the price of energy grids, which I'm going to address in my responses. First, take out the links with Mark Levinson of Issues in Science and Technology writes in 2010 that smart grids are far too expensive to build. Constructing just one would cost almost $100 billion in the United States. It's absurd to think that they would go to the developing world. But second, take out their impact because Chris Mooney of the Washington Post writes in 2015 that smart grids are ineffective. After the U.S. installed them in 50 million homes across the U.S., there was no substantial decrease in energy usage. But second, now go to their second point about cleaner energy. First, they talk about like the move to renewables, but this is just not true. Richard Martin of the MIT Technology Review writes in 2016 that the IoT would prolong the life of dying coal plants. We are currently in the middle of a transition from coal to natural gas. However, the advent of the IoT would stifle that transition by improving the performance of aging coal plants, encouraging utility companies to keep them running rather than shutting them down. He concludes that net long-term emissions will go up. But second, the free rider effect. Alex Pritchard of the University of Exeter explains that developing countries would perceive decreases in emissions as an excuse for them to relax environmental legislation, while other countries step up their action against climate change. Robert Stavins of Harvard University confirms that poorer industrializing countries have insisted that global leaders foot most of the bill in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. Indeed, Gautam Naik of Wall Street Journal writes that even if some countries reduce emissions, other countries will simply make up for pollution by increasing their industrialization. We won't see developing countries shift to renewables especially, but now go to the contention of agriculture. First, take out the link A because the International Telecommunications Union writes in 2016 that the costs associated with sensors and connectivity would prevent individual small farmers from using the IoT. They say sensors are dirt cheap, but Jim Daly of Wired writes in 2016 that typical IoT farms have thousands of sensors, when most farmers in developing countries make less than $1.25 per day, implying that they can afford full capacity IoT agricultural systems is absurd. But V. Jacob Bunch of the Wall Street Journal writes in 2014 that farmers do not trust putting their agricultural data on the internet and thus won't use it. They worry that their data might be sold to commodity traders, wind up in the hands of rival farmers, or give more leverage to giant seed companies. But second, Evan Fraser of The Guardian writes in 2016 that the IoT work in tandem with automated machines and robots to almost completely automate industrial agriculture, leading to a disproportionate loss of jobs. This means two things. A permanent loss of jobs in the agricultural sector. Adam Taggart of Free Peak Prosperity concludes in 2016 that jobs displaced by technology will never come back. But B, highly mechanized farms on large acreages can produce units of food cheaper than even the poorest paid farms in the third world. When this cheap food is sold or given to the third world, the local farm economy is destroyed. But fourth, Reuters writes that an increase in emissions inevitably leads to a loss of arable land. They predict that Africa will have almost no arable land in the near future. But now let's go to some weighing. Racism controls the internal link into economic inequality that farmers are subjected to. Robert Buller of the UNRSID writes in 2001 that institutional racism anywhere reinforces the ability of dominant countries and races to be environmentally racist. This means two things. One, developed countries carry out acts of racism against developing countries, but two, and more importantly, environmental racism as a form of intra-nation power arrangement allows members of the dominant race in each country to seclude minorities and eviscerate their ability to be economically mobile. This is not an impact that is just limited to the United States. It applies to their developing countries as well. And for these reasons, I strongly urge to vote for the negative.
Can you reasonably articulate?
That is the second rebuttal speech. Now, this is going to be first an overall theme of the round where Mission, the neg team, is going to be going pretty much a lot faster in terms of speed and technicality than Ardrey Kell, right? Ardrey Kell at this point in time and through their run on the national circuit was more of a flay-ish team, right? They knew how to, they debated technically amazingly, but did it at a lower pace. So Mission will be going a lot faster. This is an example of how their speeches will play out. Now, basically the big strategy coming out of the rebuttal here is to generate as much comparative weighing off of the case as much as possible to times through the AF summary. And they do that in two ways. One, remember, they read the MEMI evidence, very common in terms of saying we should reject racism if it's intergenerational, and it affects at a structural level, and we should prefer it over lives, for example, because they explain that lives are only temporary by the effects of racism or intergenerational. And secondly, at the link level, they explain that racism happens at an inner country level where it reinforces economic harms or developed countries like exert their willpower and hurt developing countries, and that in inside of states, ruling parties crack down on minorities, which is also bad, which is used as a prerequisite to their links. So this is the way they're generating more comparative offense off of their case, right? And so yeah, that's the big strategic consideration coming out of this rebuttal. Now, in terms of their case, right, they responded to the overview just by saying that corporations have an economic incentive for the internet, right, which is an intuitive warrant. However, something that the AF team should probably call out is, and start thinking about this in your rounds as well, is evidence, right? The evidence they use to give time frame for their defense is from the Google CEO. Of course, the Google CEO is going to be saying the internet's expanding. It's literally their business model. So that is pretty biased, right? So at this point, you'll probably see in the back half, the warrant debate on the overview is going to become pretty back and forth, given that it's a little murky right now how we should resolve the clash, or what is a very clear way to resolve the clash between these two arguments. Another kind of strategic, perhaps, blunder that they made, if you like chess, you get that reference, but that they made in this speech is he should have also addressed weighing, coming off of the idea that the internet helps the economy, right? The Freedom House evidence that says that remember, governments increase surveillance when the economy is bad, is flat out conceded in addition to the impacts, right? So as long as now the AF team wins a risk of offense into winning the link level of their overview, they've gone pretty clean offense, not only into the opponent's case, but also into the opponent's framing about discrimination, right? So that's a big thing that the AF is probably going to press on in the back of the round, because that's a really, good place for them to collapse on. And, in terms of other offense in the rebuttal, there is this one other turn that wasn't really frontlined at all about reducing the cost of living, right? It's always, not really good to miss these pieces of offense, but in the context of the overall round, this, turn isn't very heavily implicated, weighed, or contextualized. So it may be fine that the neg team is not responding to it. It's still not good that they did that, but in the context of the round, even if they didn't, it's not going to, be make or break for them, because there's not a lot of weighing or comparison coming off of that, so it's not a big valid threat to them. So with their case being done, in terms of going on to the opponent's case, right, largely what was the strategy here is to try to dump as much defense as possible, right, so they can time skew the opponents yet again. The responses were good. They responded to, and a big thing about this rebuttal is that what they did very, very well is they attacked the weak points of the case, right? For example, on the contention one, they attacked the problem with the internal link, explaining that, okay, if IoT helps renewable energy sources, IoT also helps fossil fuels. That's a very weak point in a lack of warranting that was given from First Constructive. So it's good that the neg team, and amazing that the neg team pressed on that in rebuttal. And then on their C2, right, all of the responses that the neg team gave in the rebuttal were very true. And what I mean by that is these responses just generally make a lot of intuitive sense, right? Developing country farmers that don't make a lot of money aren't probably going to be able to afford next generation technology. So quick, summary. Rebuttal strat was basically to dump as much defense on the opponent's case and try to garner as much new type of weighing and comparative offense as well. So now the affirmative summary is super, super time skewed, because they not only have to go for their offense, they have to win it now, take out the opponent's case, and also link into the weighing. So there's a lot of now stuff that's kind of piling on for the AF summaries to-do list, which was a strategy back then with shorter summaries, and is still a strategy now. So that is something to look out for as we get closer and closer to the final speeches in the round. So with that said, let's go into the second crossfire.
Why racism is more important than, let's say, like sexism, classism, ableism?
No.
So why is it particularly that we're impacting to racism is the most important, as opposed to like discriminatory prejudices in general?
No, I'm saying that racism is more important than lives, which is what you impact to, or economic mobility, which is the second set of weighting.
I just want to clarify that like all the isms are on an equal playing field, right?
Sure. Are you gonna go for an ism impact?
No.
Maybe. I don't know. All right. So
wait. Racism, sexism, and
wait,
like
we're back,
I guess
we're
ableism is
backpedaling
okay,
now
but
on the
not
answer that all
classism
isms
is
are the
different.
same.
Classism is different. Like economic mobility, that's different. We wouldn't agree that that's on the
Wait,
same level.
what's the difference between the government
So
discriminating
you were
against
gonna go
someone
for
because
that.
they're poor? versus someone- so like the difference is that like it's something Harish and I have access to. That's
No, it's not. It's because like economic mobility can happen within races as well. But it's
I
not.
understand
It's not
that,
a
but
structural
in terms
harm.
of discrimination, what is the difference?
Okay,
between
there's two responses.
I haven't
First
even
of all,
finished my. Wait, how are you
sure.
responding to a question I haven't asked?
I kind of know what you're gonna say, but yeah, just
Okay.
finish your thought.
So, in terms of the government's discrimination against people, what's the difference between the government discriminating against someone because of their skin color versus their gender versus the
So
amount
you're
of money
going
in
to
their bank
argue that
account?
classism is something that the government propagates?
I don't know what Harish is going to say in the summary. There's no reason to prefer racism
first of all,
over any other kind of institutionalized prejudice.
No, first of all, I would say that we will respond to that after Harish makes the argument, but second of all, the Bullard weighing at the bottom of my rebuttal makes it very clear that racism comes before economic mobility and controls the link into economic mobility. Can I get a question? And you've had like half a cross.
I'm really struggling with the idea on why racism is different than classism or sexism or ableism.
No,
right?
you can't put all of those four on the same playing field. Racism, sexism, and
They're all
ableism are
discrimination.
structural harms. Classism is not a form of discrimination. It is something like it's something that you're born into, right? No, sorry, that's not the right way to put it.
It seems like you're falling prejudice to like
No,
the
let me
structures
finish what
that you
I'm
condemn in
saying.
your own
Let me
case.
finish what I'm saying. Classism is something that you like the government cannot control. Now, can I get my question?
Well, yes, they can. That's what
Okay,
welfare
look,
is
we can
supposed to
get
do,
back
is
to this
try to
after, like-
offset the like repercussions
Okay,
of classism.
I'm going to ask you a question. You say that cell phones are the greatest form of discrimination.
No, I say
You
they're
said
one of the
that,
most
so-
I said the word egregious. I picked my
You
words
said
carefully.
most
It's a good word.
egregious.
I said it's the most
Yeah,
egregious
okay.
example of
What's the
police
difference
discrimination.
between that and what I asked? No, that's not my point though. If I call for your evidence, will your evidence say that cell phones cause the most egregious form of discrimination?
I mean, you can call for it.
Well, it even has a
It
superlative in it?
says the worst example.
It says that.
Yes.
Okay, I'll call for it now.
Okay, so on the Denning evidence, what exactly is it talking about in terms of 80% of what for vulnerable?
It's talking about 80% of like all technology in general.
It says smartphone apps.
No.
Okay, so after that second cross, it's pretty clear that what we call the AF won that, right? The AF was asking all of the correct questions, and the neg team was they didn't really know how to respond to it correctly, right? The biggest thing that they're going to be going for, or they could be going for in their summary speech, is the idea that economic mobility and classism is a form of discrimination, right? There's a common term called oppression Olympics, where they're going to be arguing that all isms, like they phrase it, should be on the same playing field, right? So there were a couple times the neg second speaker got tripped up there. So it's very careful when you're debating these arguments to pick your words carefully, because you don't want to offend anybody. And also, more importantly, you don't want to concede any parts of your argumentation. Probably, not as important as offending people, but it still needs to be prioritized in your speech, right? So he made it very, very clear, the AF speaker did in this crossfire, that classism does link into their framing, which is an important thing they might need to argue to gain offense under their framing. Moreover, what I would also be careful of in crosses like these is spending on a question too long, right? The AF team, like I said, probably won this cross in terms of perceptually with the judges, just kept pressing on one point. The thing that the neg team should have been saying is this: our argument is that solving racism also, starts to solve like problems like economic mobility and classism, because the weighing they read at the bottom of the rebuttal precisely says that, right? So instead of trying to get through this really long and murky debate that they had in cross, the neg team should just respond to it very quickly, analyzing arguments they already made on the flow, rather than bringing new ones up in cross and then ask a question after. Because when you're getting pressed on an argument like this, it's very easy to get flustered, and that's kind of what happened in this crossfire. So with that said, the next speech in the round is the first summary. Remember, this is 2 minutes, so it'll be a little shorter than normal, and let's begin now.
Starting on internet, realize Sam tells you that the amount of internet devices are going to triple, and the IoT fosters broadband networks in these countries. He makes a couple responses. One, he says we don't need the IoT, and second, he says with or without the IoT, internet's going to expand. Unluckily for him, he can't choose what causes of the internet expansion he wants to hit. Realize that the IoT is something that exists, and one of the reasons why the internet is going to expand is literally the IoT. So he can't pick and choose what he wants to call a cause of the internet expansion. Sam gives you 3 impacts, none of which he touched. The first is democracy. Realize that half the population has internet access. That increases the amount of democracy by 15%. That's civil liberties and political rights. Here's how that applies to their case. If you have more democracy and more civil rights, then clearly this impact or surveillance is going to be less because you can partition for political change. But secondly, the idea that a 10% increase in internet penetration leads to a 0.6% increase in GDP per capita. Realize that's benefiting people's class at the point where racism literally is a manifestation of low economic status. If we're increasing the amount of economic status, that is going to solve back partially for this impact. And third and finally, realize we increase health literacy. That's a direct impact to lives right there. But here's how this applies in the entirety to his case. First, remember Sam tells you that autocrats increase oppression when they face economic losses. So if we're insulating from economic losses, that means there's less oppression going on overall. That's a reason to vote for the IoT. Now, there's a PEPIT analysis that they don't respond to. Realize he says PEPIT tells you that because the Internet of Things is in its infancy, right now we don't see a lot of legislation protecting people against the Internet of Things. But as we continue, just like computers, we'll see more legislation that protects people. Now, lastly, on the idea of the electric grid, he tells you it's $100 billion per city. That's not true. The New York Times tells us that it's $300 billion over 20 years in all cities in the United States. Not even close to what he's saying. Next, Amin tells you that there's a 6-to-1 ratio of benefits to cost, and there's an 18% reduction in emissions. So even if you buy everything he's saying, there's still an 18% reduction in emissions. That's benefiting real people's lives, and that's a reason to affirm the resolution.
Can I see the New York Times and the 18% reduction?
Yeah.
Right, so that was the first summary. Now, from the start of their speech, right, strategically speaking, the way that they're going to be collapsing in final focus and a majority of the offense that they're going to be winning off of is from the overview, right? 1, they spend a majority of their time in summary on it, and 2, if this was intentional or not, but the only offense they have linking into the framing at all is that overview, right? So that is really the only way they can win under the overview in the round, under the framing, because what they should have done, which they didn't, might have been their strategy, is they didn't read any weighing as to how emissions solve discrimination, how it helps alleviate some form of structural oppression, which means that it's not really a voting issue in the round, even though they extend it, right? That's why they group all of their responses that the opponents read and just kind of responded it, like I said earlier, looking at from constructive, with the evidence talking about a 6-to-1 benefits of ratio of benefits to cost and an 18% reduction. So they kind of group responses there to make it as most efficient as possible. Now, on the jumping back to their case specifically, right? One strategic thing they kind of didn't do is they didn't respond to the turns about IoT increasing automation, displacing workers, right? Because that's a pretty solid turn and links into like the economy argument, which they also said the economy links into surveillance. So there's some technical turns or implications and collapse strategies that NEG can do based off of that. But in the overall, grand picture of the round, not as bad as it could have been for them, but still they should have fought that in one way or another. So now jumping back to the NEG case, right, starting with the overview, like we said, the way he frontlined it was okay, but not the best, right? What he's trying to say is that probably the reason why it's profitable is because of IoT devices, but he's making an argument that they can't pick and choose. They have conceded their warrant as to why the IoT leads to the internet expanding, meaning it's a unique benefit of the IoT, right? That could have been explained better, but that's overall what they're trying to go for. So still they have access into their offense, right? And like I said earlier, when looking at this argument from rebuttal, they should have and they did give pieces of weighing for every implication they went for, right? They said the economy increases people's incomes and lift them up the socioeconomic ladder, benefits them, solves classism, etc., and also links back into that Freedom House weighing. And on top of that, they said democracy undeniably leads to less discrimination compared to autocracies, meaning it's on net better. And then the last thing they did, which is the cleanest piece of defense for them, is going for the legal loopholes being closed response, right? This is fundamental defense, terminal defense to an extent to the NEG case, right? So looking into the NEG summary, there's 2 huge ballot threats for them. one is the overview, right? That's the only offense the AF has going into Final Focus that links into their framing. They don't really have to spend that much time on emissions, given that it doesn't link into the framing either, because the AF team has conceded that discrimination comes first, especially racism. And secondly, is the only other piece of defense on their case, which is legal loopholes. If they don't frontline this well, it is very hard for them to come back and win the round, because there's really no other offense that they probably can go for successfully besides their case. So they need to spend a lot of time winning their case in summary, as opposed to disproving the opponent's case, because that's where most of the flow is on their case. So this will be this will be the second summary. And just as a disclaimer, they're a little over there. They move to the other side of the room, so it might be a little more quiet for y'all. So just maybe turn your volume up if you need to.
For the large majority of the world by 2020, even without the Internet of Things. If the Internet was going to get there anyways without the IoT, they get no impact. It's very negligible. You can't weigh it. Then, on smart grids, the first thing that they tried to read is the New York Times says that it's going to be $300 billion for every single city. It definitely doesn't say every single city, and even then, $300 billion is still way too cost prohibitive for developing countries which don't have that much money. And third of all, it doesn't say the words Internet of Things in it at all. It's not smart cities. It's just grids in general. Then, extend 2 turns on emission, which is the impact that they go for, because they don't actually tell you how that 6-to-1 actually materializes in the pockets of consumers. First, they don't respond to Pritchard, who says that developing countries perceive decreases in emissions as an excuse for them to relax environmental legislation while other countries step up their action against that climate change or emissions. Gnaik of the Wall Street Journal then writes that if some countries reduce their emissions, others will simply make up for it and produce even more. And that's really harmful, because they don't specifically impact 2 developing countries, especially because it's so cost prohibitive. But second, you can also extend coal, which specifically says that we're going to prolong the life of coal and prevent the transition to natural gas, which means that green tech that they talk about doesn't get implemented. That's a reason not to vote for them. Now go to racism. First, group all of his responses to non-uniqueness 3 responses. First, Ardrey of the Internet writes that the Internet thinks it's incredibly weak security, unique and uninhibited network pathways to transfer data quickly. He doesn't respond to this at all. This is in contrast to conventional technology like phones and computers, which are already being encrypted heavily. That's why the cell phone stuff that he talks about isn't going to continue happening in the status quo. But second, the head of the rebuttal says, that, and also they don't respond to this, said the IoT has no anti-discrimination law, while regularized surveillance is somewhat restrained because the IoT is still an unregulated industry. He reads Pepin on the other side saying that laws will be passed, and he also reads the Saluk evidence. You can group these two together about how there's going to be a decline in the push for legislation. One, this was all before a Trump presidency and the rise of the alt-right populist movement, which wants to crack down on minority rights. Their analysis is outdated. But 2, we don't need new legislation to surveil because the existing prison program is enough to exploit this data. Then you can extend Richards, who says that the IoT brings surveillance into the physical world. Then you can extend IDG, which converts 13% more data useful to the government. They say that economic losses cause surveillance, but they don't say that economic gains means more surveillance. It's not a logical conclusion because governments want to maximize control. Then he says there's no probability, but Petraeus says that we would literally be a treasure trove for tracking data, and a bunch of countries want to do it. Then he reads Solansi saying that big data ended soft and first, but that's not the Internet of Things. And second, it just leads to more insidious forms of discrimination that are less overt, which is much worse. That gives us MEMI, which is incredibly important because you have to reject every single instance of racism. It's a precursor to lives and any form of ethical decision making whatsoever. And that's why we're proud to negate.
All right, so that was the second summary. Now, that was undeniably the fastest speech in the round. He tried to cover a lot of ground, and that might be a part of the neg's demise later in Final Focus, because at points they go really fast, which is fine, but they do it unnecessarily, where they try to cover too many arguments without going towards them in depth. So a part of the recording cut out for this video, but if it wasn't clear, he just addressed the overview to an extent just by kind of extending the same warrant that says that internet will continue to expand, right? So there's still not that large amount of clash or reason why coming from the neg side to prefer their analysis that the internet can expand absent the IoT. So still coming out of this, the AF can collapse on it effectively. So let's just go now to the AF case, right? Basically what their strategy was just to extend turns, try to generate offense off their case. Now, this would be good. However, still at this point in the round, there's no weighing as to how any environmental impact links into the MEMI framing about racism, meaning this turn really just doesn't matter in the context of the round, given that the weighing, the offense, the case offense that this turn is coming from isn't implicated to their framing. So that is a big thing to be careful of, and probably something the neg team should have looked into and tried to give weighing off that. But they also do that and extend the defense to their C1, saying how, it costs too much for smart grids. So that's a strategy on the AF case. Now what they do on the neg case is a little too fast and not in depth. They just try to speed through as the extensions and front lines as much as possible, which is good. It covers a lot of ground. Front lines are the responses, but it's at points hard to follow and not really in depth, right? Like, for example, they grouped all of the responses they read and kind of inadvertently, indirectly responded to the legal loopholes response by saying that it was before Trump, or that, they don't have good security, right? But this argument is that the governments themselves are closing, or politicians are trying to solve the legal loopholes, right? So there's still a really good chance that the AF can win this piece of defense. So coming out of the summary, they try to do as much as they can on the flow, read as much as they can, win the WEG and win their case. However, there are still parts that the AF team can really highly capitalize on, i.e. one, the overview. The weighing is super, super clean, right? The democracy implication and the weighing off of that is phenomenal. It directly turns the neg case, explaining as to why the democracy is way better for discrimination. And secondly, the legal loopholes defense, it's not very directly responded to, and it's a huge ballot threat to winning the negative case, right? So coming out of that summary, they dealt with the ballot threats, but probably didn't prioritize them as much as they should have, which might end up costing them the round in the later speeches. So with that said, let's go to Grand Crossfire.
So, is there any analysis you guys give that says that discrimination will remain unchecked? What does that mean? Right now, there might be problems because we don't have regulation regarding it, but that in the future, that will stay the same.
I feel like it's more reasonable to say that it'll stay the same than for something to change.
I know. Well, yeah, on why?
Because, for example, we've been discriminating for a long time, right?
I would say the overall trend though is from slavery to where we are today.
I'll give you that.
Even more so, the analysis I read you in my rebuttal that goes uncontested is that when groups are discriminated against, it increases their political participation.
And I agree. And I would have to argue that you have to show me that terminalizes some kind of structural change in the government, right?
Well, yeah,
100,000 more minorities vote in
Alabama.
You're
asking me to terminalize structural government changes when you can't even terminalize to me the actual increase in surveillance or increase in racial surveillance that occurs. No, you tell me that racial surveillance goes on and that the IoT facilitates surveillance, but you don't actually show me a net increase in harm, right?
What does that even mean?
You tell us that police are racist now. You also tell us on a separate tangent that the IoT creates big data, which may or may not be used to surveil on its citizens, and then you just mash those together at the end and say,
I'm actually still really confused.
How? With your own case?
No, what you're saying.
Okay, so you tell us that right now, African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be surveilled, right? Yep. That's in traditional surveillance measures. You also tell us that big data is created, which may or may not be used to surveil on people, right?
Yeah.
And then you just push those two together and say that big data will be used to surveil on minorities and will have massive incarceration disparity.
So then two things. First of all, I think that pushing them together is probably a fine logical conclusion to make. If we were racist before, we'll probably be racist with the Internet of Things too. But the second thing, right?
That's not a harm though. You understand that, right?
No.
So IoT just allows for the continuation of racism.
No. And here's why you're wrong, right?
IoT.
Here's why you're
wrong. That's not a harm of
so there's three reasons why you're wrong, and you don't really respond to any of them. The first one is the Richards evidence that says we raised the ceiling for what's surveillable, which means it's more contextually enriching and more personal. The second one is that we would say that conventional surveillance is on the decline because already conventional technology like computers and cell phones, which we were surveilling before, are being more
analysis that says that conventional surveillance is on the decline.
Yeah, that's our whole argument from Olson. And you literally read evidence that says that governments are not pushing for legislation anymore because they can't, because it's encrypted. That's your Saluk evidence.
Governments aren't pushing for legislation to allow
the
IoT
say
to
something.
surveil.
Okay, sorry, what are you saying? I mean, at the point where you haven't, you failed to give us a probability analysis.
We definitely do. Petraeus says that he wants to do it. These countries have set out and they want to do it.
And I want to win this round, but there's no guarantee that it's going to happen.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Right?
What are you saying? What more do you want? That we've already done it? Because we can give you evidence on that.
No, you're literally just telling us that
what more
door
do you
is
want?
there, and there are people who are interested. Well, how about a current politician? You literally reading someone who got fired from their job.
That's fine. Sure. We'll do that. And we did, I think.
Petraeus.
I mean, yeah.
Are you guys taking the 35 seconds of prep?
Yes, we are. I mean, I'll make it.
Okay, so that was Grand Cross. Now, obviously, things got a little bit more heated in that speech, as a lot of Grand Crosses do. But one big thing that I'd like to focus on is how the AF team kind of capitalized on the weaknesses in the negs collapse and argumentation, right? In as a result of them kind of just blipping through everything and going really fast in summary, they didn't really continue to extend the contextualization as to why the IoT is uniquely different, than all of these like other forms of surveillance. So that's what the Ardrey Kell focused on in Grand Cross, and again pressured them for the second cross in a row on the point as to why it's any different than other surveillance, or it makes discrimination uniquely worse, right? And that is an example of burden setting, where Ardrey is basically, trying to make it as clear to the judges as possible, even if they don't bring it up in a speech in final, saying that they need to win this specific idea to gain any offense in their case. So that's how they're kind of going to be approaching their case, perhaps in final focus. So that's kind of just a good segue to show how you can kind of use ideas brought up in Grand Cross to segue into arguments you make in final focus. Now, of course, those new arguments can't really be brought up in final focus, but with any type of judge, pointing out perceptual and logical weaknesses or drops in extensions, for example, for detectives in Grand Cross, is always great. So they kind of utilize that in this round, and they'll continue to utilize that in first final focus, which we're about to start now.
So the main reason you're going to be affirming in today's round is that undoubtedly the Internet of Things makes the world a better place. On a quick observation level, what I tell you in rebuttal from Pepin is that while loopholes may exist right now to allow discrimination through the Internet of Things, those loopholes are being closed, meaning that literally their entire case, their only terminal impact to racism, is being solved back for it in the status quo. At that point, you have no unique reason to negate. Even more so, what I tell you in Grand Crossfire is that they never show you an actual increase in the amount of racial surveillance that's going on, rather a continuation of the status quo, which is not a harm of decreased personal privacy. You have no reason to negate today's round, but I'm going to give you two reasons on top of that on why you're affirming. The first is the spread of the Internet. What the GWSA finds is that while there may be other reasons for why the Internet's spreading, such as Google and Facebook's cooperative initiative, they find that the IoT will facilitate a tripling in the amount of devices connected to the Internet. That does two things. The first comes from Wade, in which she finds that you increase democracy by 15%. The comparative analysis to do here is that if you value combating racial and injustice structures, that will always be easier to do in a democracy as opposed to an autocracy. So we're actually linking into their terminal impact better than they are. The second comes from Chu, which finds that you increase per capita GDP by 0.6%. The analysis I give you rebuttal that goes uncontested is that authoritarian regimes increase their surveillance in face of economic losses. So transitively, when we help the economy, you decrease surveillance. If you think surveillance is so terrible, then you're going to want to decrease it, and the only way to do that is through providing economic gains, which are made possible through the Internet of Things. The second way in which the Internet of Things makes the world a better place is by revolutionizing energy. What we tell you is that smart grids will be applied. What they tell you is that they will cost hundreds of billions of dollars per smart grid. What Harish tells you from the New York Times is that it will cost $300 billion to apply smart grids to every major U.S. city. What Alvarez tells you is historically, when you apply smart grid, you increase green technology usage, which is why Amin finds in his holistical empirical analysis that you increase efficiency 18%, decrease emissions 18%, and on net, there is a 6-to-1 ratio of benefits to costs. If that's not beneficial enough, then I don't know what is. Because the Internet of Things is always a step in a positive direction. I urge you to affirm.
Okay, so that was the first final focus. Very, very good final focus, right? This is slow and steady, and from a structural perspective, it's a voter type of final focus. Instead of jumping right at every part of the flow, he basically extends defense at the top and focusing on two places judges can vote for them, right? First, the defense he went for is the right one. Very, very good. The legal loopholes analysis takes out the time frame of their argument. Secondly, which is probably the most important piece of offense he went for, is the overview. The democracy link is clean, and the comparison now is a little cleaner on the link level, right? Still, it's a little, murky and can be a wash, but insofar as they're cleanly winning a warrant into why there's a tripling of devices to the Internet, that's giving them offense into the democracy impact and weighing. Now, they also go for the economy impact off of this. there was a response given by Max in the second summary as to why the economy thing may not be the like Freedom House evidence may not be a good piece of defense. He said that it was very blippy and short, and so the judges probably maybe not didn't pick up on that, and he didn't either. But even absent that, right, they're still clearly winning the democracy, so they're getting really good offense in their case. Last thing is they went for emissions, right? This is probably obviously not where the judges are going to be looking to vote for the app the most. However, it's really good to extend this still, because now it time skews the second final to also respond to this offense as well. So by not only extending the overview, but giving a second path to the ballot in emissions, it makes the job for second final a lot harder, which is why the AF is, pulling ahead in first final focus. So that was basically the overall strategy for first final. And let's go to second final.
I'm just gonna repeat that. Sorry. It's okay. On the internet argument, the only card that's exempted in final focus is the GWSA card that says that 3 times more devices are connected to the internet, but that doesn't mean the actual internet spreads. They can't access their impact there, but even then, Gross says that the internet would reach these countries by 2020 anyway, so they get no offense. But now, let's go to the energy. There are 2 clean drop turns here. That's the easiest way to sign your ballot. First, the free rider effect says, from Pritchard tells you that developing countries would perceive decreases in emissions as an excuse for them to relax environmental progress. That gives you statements that says that poor industrializing countries have insisted that global leaders put most of the bill, and so that move to renewables will never happen, and that is a non-net harm for their case. But second, Reuters writes that an increase in emissions inevitably leads to a loss of arable land. They predict that Africa will have almost no arable land in the near future. And finally, the only response they have left on this argument is the 18% decrease in emissions on net. That evidence does not say on net. Please call for it. But now go to our case. The couple of responses he has left. First, he says that there's new legislation being passed. First of all, that is very outdated. That is before Trump was elected. But second, all of his remaining responses are about racism happening right now. But we give you 3 unique responses from the summary that were not responded to in the first final focus. First of all, the Azori evidence tells you that IoT components are fundamentally characterized by low capabilities in energy and computing resources and cannot implement security measures and cannot be encrypted. But second, Peppa tells you that the kind of discrimination the IoT brings cannot be controlled by anti-discrimination laws. But third, Richards writes that the IoT brings surveillance into the physical world and raises the ceiling for what can and can't be surveilled. These are 3 very unique ways that the IoT increases the ability for governments to be racist. And the IDG on net says there's a 13% increase in useful data for the government to use in surveillance. Kumar says that any expansion of the surveillance data will be racist, and Goldstein says that this happens in both the developed and developing countries. They just do not have enough defense left on our case to win our case. And now finally, Beckett says the most inevitable consequence is the suppression of minorities, and that gives us the Many Wayne, who says that we must reject every instance of racism. No life is worth living if some lives are valued over others. They never contest this way. Institutional racism is a systemic impact. It happens every second of every day. If we keep surveilling African Americans at disproportional rates, we normalize racism to the point that we start to ignore it, like my opponents have in this round. But second, the Bullard warning tells you that institutional racism is a prerequisite to targeting economic mobility and environmental racism, which are the 2 things that their case talks about. So even if you don't mind many, we are still a prerequisite to their case. And for these reasons, I strongly urge you to vote for the column.
Okay, so that again is good second final focus, right? It still continues that overall theme of going pretty fast in the speeches and covering a lot on the flow, right? Here is where the neg could have really made the difference, right? They should probably have started their second final by framing out the emissions argument with talking about MEMI and the racism wing. That's the best chance of them having the path of the ballot, right? But instead, they started on the emissions terms, right? Even though these were conceded, they're not weighed, implicated, or contextualized, meaning even if they're winning them, it's just kind of floating pieces of offense that don't link into the wing, right? If both teams are agreeing that like this discrimination comes first, right? Judges aren't probably going to feel very keen to vote on the environment, right? Then the switches over to their case. They didn't really frontline or extend any responses to the overview at all. So the overview is very, very, very clean, which is probably the reason why the AF team won the round, right? Secondly, the biggest ballot threat, like we said, is the legal loopholes response, right? They just kind of extended 3 responses through ink about this, right? These 3 responses are unique warrants as to why IoT is good. They're phenomenal warrants. However, they're not really interactive or not directly implicated to the idea that legal loopholes are solving IoT right now, right? No matter how much evidence you throw at a response, if you're not implicating and doing link comparison, that evidence won't matter. And then lastly, they extend their case and they, extend their weighing. So that's the end of the round. Looking from, taking a step back, it was a good round, right? Close. Both teams are phenomenal, historically great debaters. But I think the reason why the AF team won this round, and they won on a 2-1 decision, is specifically because of the styles. Not only did the AF team make better argumentation and implicate better in the back half, but they did it in a better style. They were more persuasive. They made better comparison and better analysis, right? Although maybe at some portions of the flow mission, the neg team was technically winning, right? On the emission turn, for example, they were going too fast and were spewing too much. They didn't collapse on too much, on too little content in final and in summary to be able to adequately win the parts of the flow that mattered, i.e. the overview, i.e. the link defense on their case. So as a byproduct of that, right, that severely hurt them in the final focus speech and in summary as well, where they didn't have time and didn't do the in-depth analysis they should have, and to frame out the overview, the link defense, and win the lane, right? If they did that more effectively, they could have most likely pulled through and had a better chance of winning the round. So I'll leave you all with this. If you want to improve your skills, I would redo these speeches. The best ones to redo are probably the neg teams, right? The neg summary, the neg final focus. Practice first handling the weighing, explaining why the racism framing and it conceded is so key to you winning the ballot. Secondly, try to condense the round, right? Instead of going for 2 or 3 turns on the AF case, win the response and win the overview on your case, and then go for 1 or 2 responses on their case. Because remember, the biggest thing that we should take away from this round is ballot and response prioritization, right? The AF team did that phenomenally. They predicted and they went for the arguments that will win them the round, and they use a lot of good ballot directive language to convey that to the judges. However, the neg team went, like we said, for the kitchen sink, extended too much, which hurt them in analysis in the back half. So try to focus on what matters to winning the ballot, most importantly, if you're reading the neg speeches, and that will help you improve your speeches on this topic and future ones to come. With that being said, that is the end of this round analysis. Thank you all for watching, and y'all have a good rest of the day.